is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Juliet Mann. And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories.
Our city of Bucha is only one of many examples of what the occupiers have been doing on our land for the past 41 days. The world has yet to learn the truth.
Ukraine's president calls for Russian troops and their leaders to face a war crimes tribunal. He warns the world has yet to see the full extent of their atrocities.
Scene of a massacre. We go inside the town of Bucha, where Russians allegedly gunned down civilians, including children.
A crackdown on coal imports worth billions. The EU proposes a new package of sanctions on Russian goods.
And the landscapes shaped by war, how old conflicts make their mark long after the fighting ends.
Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has told the United Nations that Russia must face an international tribunal over allegations of war crimes committed by Russian troops.
He has accused Moscow of genocide after hundreds of civilians were killed in the town of Bucha, 25 kilometres from the capital, Kyiv. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, John Terrett, who's in New York. John, talk us through what's been happening at the UN today.
Well, Juliet and Robin, as you can imagine, it's been a pretty harrowing morning here in New York as we've listened to what President Zelensky had to say. He told the Council on video link that he just returned from Bucha, where he saw Ukrainian people who'd been killed for standing up for our country. He said these are the worst war crimes since World War II. He said women, children, dogs had been killed. Their bodies had been burned in many cases. He said that they were shot on the street, in their apartments, in their houses. Some of them were thrown into wells. Some of the women were raped and then killed. Tongues pulled out because they couldn't talk to the Russians in terms that the Russians wanted to hear. And some were run over by tanks as they sat in their cars. All this according to President Zelensky, who also said that the global food crisis is coming. There's a food shortage coming, which will affect Africa and Asia in particular. And he addressed the Security Council members directly. He said, where is the security that the Security Council guarantees? And he asked members of the Security Council, are you ready to close the UN, he said? Has the era of international law gone? Well, if not, he said, you've got to act immediately. And he called for reform at the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, so that it may be more effective in the future. And very memorably, he said that the town of Bucha was not the only example of atrocities that he had come across in Ukraine. Here's what he said next.
Now the world can see what the Russian military did in Bucha while keeping the city under their occupation. But the world has yet to see what they've done in other cities and regions of our country. Geography may be different or various, but cruelty is the same, crimes are the same, and accountability must be inevitable.
Well, President Zelensky then tried to play a short video which actually would not play on the Security Council system. So he went away, and then they had other speakers, and then they played the video that Zelensky wanted to be played later. It was very, very short. It was very, very, very harrowing. Well, other speakers today following on, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, who's the US ambassador to the United Nations, saying we can't look away from the atrocities, and she repeated her call that Russia be bounced off the Human Rights Council, which is based in Geneva. She said that's something we can do collectively in the General Assembly, and now is the time to match words with actions. And Vasily Nebenzia, who is the Russian ambassador representing the Russian Federation to the United Nations. He spoke for quite a while, not mentioning Bucha, certainly at the beginning, nor talking about the war crimes issue that this Security Council meeting was supposed to talk about regarding President Putin. That didn't really come up today in the way that we thought it would, so he cast that to one side. He addressed President Zelensky directly, saying that the allegations you're making about the Russian military are uninformed allegations. He said Nazis are running the show in Ukraine. And he gave plenty of examples of atrocities around the country, but he said that they were carried out by the Ukrainian forces and not the Russian military. He said, you lay the blame on the Russian military. This is unacceptable. And then towards the end, he said, you only saw what they showed you. The corpses were not there when we left the area around Bucha. Guys?
Well, John, the economic squeeze on Russia continues. The United States blocking Russian debt payments. What more can you tell us about that?
It's a little bit complicated, but it's easy to understand when you realize what's going on. Basically, the existing sanctions that have been in place now for a month or so against Russia, they prevent Moscow from accessing $600 billion that it keeps in U.S. financial institutions around the world, and which have been placed there by the Russian central bank. Now, it can't access that money, but until this last 24 hours, the U.S. Treasury has allowed the Russians to make payments on what they call coupons on dollar-denominated sovereign debt. In other words, debt that it owes to people who've invested in Russia. It must pay that, otherwise that's called a default. And the Treasury has allowed them to do that up till now, but on a case-by-case basis. Every time a payment comes up, they review it in Washington first. Now, my understanding is that on Monday, a big payment of $552.4 million, which was the principal payment on a maturing bond, was not paid, nor was $84 million on a 2042 savings dollar bond. So that money did not apparently go out. Now, why are they doing this? It's designed to try and force Moscow to use the dollars and the euros that it has access to. And remember, it still does have access to those because the Europeans are buying an awful lot of energy, as they have to, in dollars and euros. Forget about the converting it into ruble story for now. That's another issue. It still has access to euros and dollars. And the idea behind this latest sanction is that they will force Moscow to use it on paying down debt, sovereign bonds, that sort of thing, rather than diverting any of it to the special operation in Ukraine. Finally, Jake Sullivan, special advisor on security issues to the president, has said that there will be even more sanctions announced against Russia later in the week. Juliet and Jamie and Robin.
John, thank you very much for that update.
Italy and Denmark have become the latest European nations to expel Russian diplomats over the apparent massacre in Bucha. Despite the anger and accusations, President Zelensky says negotiations with Moscow must continue in order to avoid Russian troops returning to previously occupied positions. Ukrainian forces are said to have retaken key terrain around the capital, Kyiv. Let's talk now to our correspondent, Yolo Abdavith, who's in Kyiv. Yolo, what more do we know about the situation in Bucha now?
Well, ever since those photographs and images started filtering out and were shown online about 2 days ago, journalists have obviously been trying to get into Bucha. Investigations are continuing, and dozens of journalists, me included, broke a curfew to get into that town to see exactly what had been taking place. Now, some of what we saw and were told had happened in Bucha apparently has happened, allegedly has happened elsewhere as well. And it may change Western governments' point of view in terms of this war in Ukraine. Now, our report has some images which some viewers may find distressing.
Situated so close to Ukraine's capital city, Bucha now has a reputation all of its own. But the dark secret of Russian occupation is already known. St. Andrew's Church contains a mass grave where dozens of civilians, reportedly killed by Russian soldiers, were buried together.
People died in different circumstances. Some died because of the Russian shelling, others were killed in their cars. Russians were killing people who simply walked on the street. The city was littered with the corpses. You'd walk and see dead bodies everywhere. It isn't some kind of accident, but deliberate murder.
Gradually, facts are being uncovered, but more bodies in black plastic bags still arrive as the town's streets are cleared. Initially, 68 people were laid here.
From the 10th of March, bodies were brought here to the local church because there was no room in the hospital morgue and people didn't want to leave these bodies on the streets. So they were killed by shelling or shot on the streets of Bucha. And as it was too dangerous to go to the cemetery, locals brought these bodies here.
Russia denies the accusations, calling the photographs that have been published showing corpses on the streets as fake or staged.
We believe these are war crimes, and they will be recognized by the world as genocide. You are here and can see what happened.
Signs of battles, destruction and occupation are clear, as are the testimonies of those who have survived. Olga Antonova says her neighbor was shot by Russian soldiers and buried in the backyard.
Anyone who walked on the street, Russian soldiers shouted at them to stop. If they didn't, they shoot them immediately and moved the bodies over there. One man who lived here told them, "I'm from Russia, Tataran, here's my passport." The soldiers said, "Stop, stop," and then killed him. They dragged him by his legs and left his body there. After a week, we buried him.
Not far from St. Andrew's Church, those who stayed are still coming to terms with a 5-week assault on their town. Timur, a 21-year-old marketing student, was with a dozen neighbors without water, electricity or heating, and spoke about the Russian soldiers.
They checked every flat, every corner, every person who lived here to find some weapons, to find some Nazis, as they call it, because they told that there are a lot of Nazis, but we didn't find anybody.
Bucha has been brutalized. The scale of the destruction will take time and money to repair. The scars of seeing hundreds of corpses lining the streets will take far longer to heal.
Some 280 people are believed to have been killed as ordinary civilians in Bucha. Most of the bodies have now been cleared from the streets. But we saw the smashed cars, we saw the mass grave. And of course, it's proving that there was a war crime here, is what the Ukrainian government are trying to do now. Robin.
Yolo Abdavov in Kyiv, thank you.
Russia continues to deny its troops were responsible for war crimes in Bucha, as we just heard there from Yolo. The Kremlin says the allegations are a monstrous forgery aimed at denigrating the Russian army. Stephen Cole spoke to Russian Federation Senator Konstantin Kosachev.
The bodies, the crops would have changed, you know, for just physical reasons. This is number one. And secondly,
but that's been disproved by pathologists who've examined the evidence.
Just imagine a city of 30,000 people and so many relatives to these killed people, leaving them outside, not trying to get them in, not trying to bury them, not trying to assist people who had been wounded. For me, this is absolutely impossible to imagine. Just let them lie in the street in 1 or 2 weeks? Come on. This is absolutely excluded. Absolutely excluded. These people were killed 1 or 2 days before this filming was made, during the period when the Russian forces were already out, had been out of the city of Bucha.
That's not according to the AFP, who've been showing images of dead bodies on the 2nd of April. And there are videos of corpses circulating that I've seen on social media on the 1st of April.
The Russian forces left Bucha on the 30th of March.
The Defense Ministry, as you know, claimed that while Bucha was under Russian control, a quote, "not a single local resident has suffered from any violent action." That's patently untrue, isn't it?
Well, I have not read a single piece of information confirming any reaction from local people living in Bucha and telling the world on the 1st of April, the 2nd of April, the 31st of March, anything about this tragedy. It did not exist on the 31st of March, the 1st of April, probably not the 2nd of April, and this is exactly what we keep talking about. This provocation was arranged later on in order to blame the Russians.
You're in a very difficult position as a diplomat to see Russia so increasingly isolated from the rest of the world. Do you feel Russia is standing alone?
Definitely not. Definitely not. I know perfectly well that the United Nations consists of 193 countries. I know perfectly well that just 40 countries plus practice sanctions against Russia. 40 countries out of 193 is less than 1/5. It is not the international community. It's not the majority, and Russia definitely does not feel isolated. The feeling of an isolated Russia may appear only if you look at Russia from Washington or the Brussels, for example. But we have so many other places which are different from the Western world and which are still balanced, which are still very much concerned about the NATO expansion, which are very much concerned about the attempts of the Western world to create a unipolar construction of this world. So definitely Russia is not isolated, Russia is definitely not alone, and Russia definitely will not give up because some 40 countries see the future of the world differently.
Still ahead, shoppers in Germany see prices rise as higher production costs begin to bite.
The British public not only need to know, but they want to know more about China.
70 years ago, a small group of British businessmen travelled to China to unlock opportunities between the two countries. They became known as the icebreakers.
East meets West. We're now at a time when we need the icebreaker spirit.
My first impression when I came to China is I noticed the similarities more than the differences.
It's about understanding each other's culture.
We look at the things that bring our nations together.
My dad is Chinese, my mum is English. I grew up in London, but I went to China to work at age 25.
Whenever I've gone to China, it's just been amazingly welcoming.
The music is beautiful language and bringing all the people together.
I'm exploring, I'm experimenting, I'm trying something new, all in the hopes to build a bridge. And I think we definitely need more people doing that.
It was only when I got to know my Chinese father in my 40s that I really got to know the other half of myself.
I hope we make it another 50 years, another 500 years.
Meet the bridge builders, the individuals who dared to think beyond the horizon and to open up our world, on TV and online on CGTN.
I hope that you will all become icebreakers and bridge builders.
Welcome back. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all the major digital platforms, on Smart TV or online, on Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app. And in the UK, we're available 24 hours a day on Freeview.
The European Union says more sanctions are on the way against Russia after the massacre in Bucha. Ursula von der Leyen and Josep Borrell have said they'll travel to Kyiv this week to meet President Zelensky. Our correspondent Dan Ashby is in Brussels. Dan, the European Commission is proposing an immediate ban on Russian coal imports and stepping up efforts to reduce Europe's dependency on Russian gas. How likely is it, though, that EU countries will agree to this?
Yes, it's looking pretty likely at this stage, I have to say, because normally when the EU Commission makes proposals for these sanctions, they do get passed through by the member states. There may be some tweaks here and there, but by and large they try to stick to what the Commission has suggested. So, and significantly, we may be looking at an EU ban on Russian coal. Now, this is the first time that Russian energy has been put into a sanction. Not gas, which is the big one, but starting with coal, because traditionally and over the past few weeks it has been Germany who's been worried about banning Russian gas because it's such a big part of their energy makeup and would hurt the EU almost as much as it would hurt Russia, particularly Germany, whose industries rely on it. But there's been these furious negotiations and it seems to be coming down to looking at coal instead. So as you say, that's been put into the proposals along with a load of other measures, including transaction bans for 4 of the biggest Russian banks, bans on other imports from Russia, bans on European money ending up in Russian public life. So a toughening of sanctions from the EU as, of course, European countries are kicking out diplomats. By one estimate, more than 120 diplomats kicked out in the last 48 hours alone. So those proposals will go to member states, but we are expecting them to get passed through.
Dan, we've heard from NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg today. His condemnation of the alleged war crimes has been fairly strong, hasn't it?
Yes, he has said that this is the most brutal scenes to be seen in Europe since the Second World War, horrific scenes, but I think significantly also saying that the war is reaching a new and crucial stage, pointing out that Russian troops are now leaving Kyiv, they are also leaving the north of Ukraine, but that they could be amassing in the east and south of Ukraine. Here's what he had to say.
In the coming weeks, we expect a further Russian push in the eastern and southern Ukraine to try to take the entire Donbass and to create a land bridge to occupied Crimea. So this is a crucial phase of the war. And as Ukraine faces this new offensive, NATO foreign ministers will discuss what more we will do.
Now, why is that so significant? Because what it could mean is that we'll see an amassing of Russian troops and a change from the type of conflict where you've seen Ukrainians picking off Russian supply lines, a more scattered type of war, perhaps a lead towards a more conventional war with larger amounts of troops. So potential concerns there, and NATO very stark in its words, saying that in the next few weeks, within weeks, we may see the start of a major new Russian offensive. In terms of the NATO response, we'll find out more about that in the next 48 hours as foreign ministers meet here in Brussels to decide really what NATO is going to do next.
Dan Ashby in Brussels, many thanks.
A prolonged war in Ukraine risks being very much worse for the European economy than even the coronavirus pandemic due to supply chain disruption, energy scarcity and inflation. Now, European inflation is already at a 30-year high of 5.5%. And the EU says that much of that increase is due to the war taking place. Now, in Spain, inflation jumped to 9.8% compared to March last year. This is the highest level there since 1985. In Germany, it rose above 7%. That's the highest level in 40 years. In Italy, the increase 6.7%. And in France, it was a record in March at 5.1%. Well, Angelica Crystal Donati is president of ANCE Giovanni, Italy's National Construction Association. And she told me inflation has been hugely aggravated by the war in Ukraine.
Well, the war in Ukraine has accelerated inflationary pressures that have been underway since at least the end of 2020. The Italian construction sector has seen rising prices since October or November 2020. So it's an additional pressure on a phenomenon that was well underway.
So what impact could all that have on ordinary households?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, if you consider the fact that energy prices have gone up by 1,000%, household bills have gone up fivefold. It's starting to make a big difference for families' bottom line. Then you can only imagine the effect it's having on businesses, especially companies that use a lot of energy to produce their goods.
And it's not just energy, is it? It's critical materials. And the impact all of that is having on construction. I mean, from steel to ceramics, and one we might be less familiar with, cotton.
The biggest center of production for Corten in Europe is Ukraine. And so obviously all Corten supply from Ukraine, or most of it, has stopped due to the war. So my company builds infrastructure projects in Italy. And Corten is an essential component for viaducts, so for bridges in Italy. Italy has chosen to use Corten as a key structural component for viaducts. And all of our suppliers have written to us over the past few weeks telling us that they must stop supplying us with the Corten products because they have no raw materials coming in from Ukraine, and so they have no way of quoting us or letting us know when they can actually deliver.
So building projects are going to cost more, they're going to be delayed. Is there a danger, do you think, that important infrastructure projects and then the maintenance of things like bridges could actually stop altogether?
The danger is enormous, also because due to inflationary pressures, due to raw material shortages, current projects that are underway, so we're not even talking about future projects which will be built under the Recovery Fund plans, but the current projects that were perhaps assigned a couple of years ago and are currently underway are seeing massive increases in their costs. Companies are losing money every day, and so it's a twofold problem. It's a supply-driven problem and it's a cost-driven problem. It's unsustainable to think that companies will continue working at a loss.
So if it's unsustainable, if they can't continue working at a loss, what happens next? Are we going to see companies fold? Are we going to see skeletons of future building projects just sitting there for decades?
That's very possible. The scenario is pretty clear. Either governments step in and do something drastic and very strong to support companies in the sector, or projects will stop and companies will fold. There was a scary number which came out the other day, which is that around 40% of companies in the construction field risk going under due to cost increases. And that's a massive alarm bell for us to all heed.
So you want to see governments stepping in. I mean, is the situation just going to keep getting worse, or do you see an end in sight?
I honestly don't. I would imagine, I would hope that we are towards the end of the curve. I would hope that we're not going to see many more upwards pressures. I hope the war in Ukraine will resolve itself, or that there will be a solution to it, but that will not stop inflation from continuing at the current pace, and especially won't stop prices from remaining at all-time highs as they are today. I think high prices are here to stay, so there need to be long-term measures put in place. Price lists for tenders need to be revised upwards. More funds need to be deployed for existing projects, and future projects need to be rebudgeted so that they can be actually carried out, because no company in its right mind will bid for something that is below their costs.
Prices in shops have gone up in Germany due to rising production costs, in some cases by as much as 50%. Natalie Carney has more from Munich.
A second round of price increases has hit pocketbooks across Germany. This comes following a warning from the German Retail Association. The first wave saw an increase of about 5% on everyday items as a result of increased energy prices. Now we are seeing prices rise as high as 50%, brought on in large part by the conflict in Ukraine hitting economies and the supply chains and sending the prices of oil and gas soaring even higher. In some grocery stores, we're seeing items like a stick of butter that used to cost upwards of around $2.99, now as high as $3.99, due to the increase in prices from suppliers. According to one grocery chain across Germany, Aldi, about 2 weeks ago, 160 items became more expensive, and then a week later, another 20 were added to that list. Other supermarket brands quickly followed suit. The cost of living here in Germany is at its highest level since reunification, with everyday items increasing by an average of 7.3%. The good news is, however, despite almost everything becoming more expensive, industry experts don't expect there to be a shortage of products anytime soon. Yet these higher prices have sparked a new round of panic buying, not seen since the first months of the COVID pandemic, forcing some supermarkets to start limiting the purchase of things like cooking oil and flour. Natalie Carney for CGTN in Munich, Germany.
Well, after becoming Twitter's largest shareholder, Tesla's chief executive, Elon Musk, is joining the social media company's board of directors. It comes the day after Musk revealed he'd bought a 9.2% stake in the social media giant. The purchase sent Twitter shares up more than 20% on Monday.
Amazon says it has signed the biggest rocket launch deal in commercial space history. The tech giant's finalised contracts with 3 companies for more than 80 launches of its internet satellites. It wants to build a network of satellites orbiting Earth at a low level, providing high-speed internet services anywhere in the world.
General Motors and Honda say they'll begin jointly developing a series of affordable electric vehicles. The partnership's expected to produce millions of low-cost EVs priced below $30,000.
Still ahead on Global Business Europe. Emmanuel Macron is facing a tough challenge from far-right politician Marine Le Pen as France prepares for the first round of its presidential election.
It is now important that all of us in Europe act very swiftly.
Fines for the non-vaccinated will most likely be between $1,000 and $4,000.
The new Omicron variant circulating in southern Africa.
The financial markets have also reacted badly to the news.
Growing dissatisfaction with the way the Dutch government is handling the pandemic.
Cancelling the city's main public Christmas markets for the 2nd year in a row.
Protests and riots by those opposed to restrictions and vaccinations.
There is no room for complacency in this ongoing battle against COVID.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and me, Juliette Mann. The headlines again. Ukraine's president calls for Russian troops and their leaders to face a war crimes tribunal and warns the world has yet to see the full extent of their atrocities.
Scene of a massacre. We look inside the town of Bucha, where Russians allegedly gunned down civilians, including children.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg rebuked Russia for what he called war crimes committed in underground Bucha. His comments came ahead of a meeting of European foreign leaders to discuss delivering more weapons to Ukraine.
We have all seen the horrific images of murdered civilians in Bucha and other places controlled by the Russian military until a few days ago. Targeting and murdering civilians is a war crime. All the facts must be established, and all those responsible for these atrocities must be brought to justice.
So how could a case for war crimes be made against Russia after events in Ukraine? Russia is not a member of the International Criminal Court, where trials are held. Recent cases relating to the war in the former Yugoslavia also show how prosecutions can drag on for years. Well, joining me now is Nadia Volkova, who's director of the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group. She joins us now from Kyiv. Welcome to the programme, Nadia. From a Ukrainian point of view, if you were gathering evidence to prove possible war crimes, what kind of thing would you be presenting?
Well, we collect witness testimonies and victims' testimonies. We do the screening. We get their consent for the future accountability processes, courts and other mechanisms. We also go to potential crime scenes and might collect physical evidence, although that would require a proper preservation by the authorities. And we cooperate with authorities to the extent that it is possible.
So what are investigators looking for? How do they verify what they're seeing?
Again, if they have access to victims and witnesses, they should collect their testimonies. They preserve physical evidence. They can also collect intercepts from telephone calls or tapping data, and also open source information as well as one of the essential evidentiary tools at the moment.
How difficult is it then to eventually prove war crimes and to bring those responsible to justice?
It is difficult. Justice is generally difficult, and when we talk about international justice, it's even more complex, but it's not impossible. So we hope that essentially what is done in the context of Ukrainian situation, although it's a new challenge for justice, but it will also lay out a new landscape for justice possibilities.
And not every country is party to the International Criminal Court. So what happens in a situation where the country being tried doesn't recognise its jurisdiction?
Well, with the International Criminal Court, the link is through the territory where an alleged crime has been committed, and also nationality link. So it doesn't matter if Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute. What matters is that the crimes are committed on the territory of Ukraine and by the nationals of Russian Federation.
And war crime cases often take many years to come to trial. Does there come a point where it's just too late to prosecute?
Yes, when a victim wants to see the perpetrator brought to trial, brought to justice, and the perpetrator dies, for example. But hopefully it won't be the case in our situation.
Okay, Nadia Volkova, Director of the Ukrainian Legal Advisory Group, thanks very much for sharing your views today.
China's ambassador to the United Nations Security Council has just been speaking following the appearance of Ukraine's Volodymyr Zelensky. He's echoed calls for an investigation into the events in Bucha.
Under international law, civilians should be spared of any forms of violence in armed conflict, and attacks against civilians are unacceptable and should not occur. The reports and images of civilian deaths in Bucha are very disturbing, and the relevant circumstances and specific causes of the incident must be verified and established.
The EU is to launch a disciplinary procedure against Hungary that would see a freeze on funding from Brussels. It comes amid a continuing dispute over Hungary's domestic policies and follows Prime Minister Viktor Orban's landslide re-election. From Budapest, Trent Murray reports.
As the dust settles on Hungary's decisive election, much of Europe is trying to assess how an emboldened Viktor Orban will work with colleagues in the European Union. Hungary's Prime Minister has long clashed with Brussels over policies on human rights, judicial independence and media freedom inside of Hungary. Many of those issues remain unresolved, a point senior EU officials have been keen to point out since his weekend win.
I think there is really something to be thought of by all the member states. Do they accept that in European Union you have people who are fed with disinformation about Europe, who are where the European money is misused, and do we accept it? I have already had people telling me, well, if they voted for these people, okay, maybe we keep Hungary as it is. This is now a question for all Europe.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is also straining some of Orban's relations with other EU capitals. President Vladimir Putin was one of the first leaders to congratulate the Hungarian PM on his re-election, a sign that a predicted ratcheting up of EU sanctions against Russia's energy sector could be derailed by Orban, who has recently signed fresh gas deals with the Kremlin. As the war rages just a couple of hours' drive from here, Hungary's role within NATO is also facing fresh scrutiny. While Orban has agreed to allow additional US troops to be based here in the country, he maintains he's firmly against allowing any weapons for Kiev to be transferred across Hungary's border. That's in stark contrast to traditional Central European allies like Poland, who have grown increasingly frustrated in recent weeks with what they see as Hungary not doing enough of the heavy lifting to help Ukraine. Professor Zoltan Yeti of Central European University says that the split could leave Hungary isolated within the bloc.
I think it will be more of the same, and in general, after each victory, Orban became more autocratic. So you could expect even harsher conflicts with institutions of EU. Maybe he will try to experiment with a new strategy, but I think he maneuvered himself into a corner, and it's very difficult how he can get out of that.
As a clearer picture emerges of the brutality taking place in Ukraine, pressure is growing inside the EU for a stronger, united response. But leaders of member states can veto foreign policy measures, which is why in the coming days and weeks, Brussels will likely be having some very frank discussions on how best to negotiate with a freshly emboldened Viktor Orban. Trent Murray, CGTN, Budapest.
French President Emmanuel Macron is facing a tough challenge in the form of far-right veteran Marine Le Pen. 5 days away from his re-election bid, Macron has seen his poll lead slip, and analysts are predicting a runoff between the pair. Well, our correspondent Ryan Thompson is in Paris. Hello to you, Ryan. We're 5 days away now from polls opening, so where do things stand at the moment?
Hi there, Robin. That's right. We are in the home stretch of this election before that first round of voting, where we go from a field of candidates, around 12, to just 2, the top 2, which will ultimately go head-to-head in about 2 weeks' time. At this stage in the election, though, we are seeing these candidates really try and pick up every single percentage point they can, because this isn't such a big race where you're trying to get a majority. You're just trying to get those top 2 spots. So we see the race really changing from what it was just a few weeks ago, where the number 3 spot is a completely different person. We are seeing the Republican Party completely exit the picture. The socialist mayor of Paris is no longer part of this discussion. And in fact, we're seeing candidates like Jean-Luc Mélenchon from France Unbound really become a key player here, potentially somebody who is fighting for second place. Though the big story, as you highlighted here, is the fact that Marine Le Pen has really seen a surge in the polls in recent weeks, as coming after this boost we've seen for the incumbent president, Emmanuel Macron.
And Ryan, this isn't the first time we've talked about the possibility of Marine Le Pen becoming president. Is it actually going to happen this time? What's the likelihood?
Well, Robin, the stark difference this time is the numbers. Most recent polling suggests that in the second round, it would be 53% of voters for Emmanuel Macron compared to 48% of voters siding with Marine Le Pen. But if you look at the numbers from 2017, the last time these two candidates went head-to-head, the difference between them was much more stark. Emmanuel Macron took home 66% of voter support compared to just about 34% for Marine Le Pen. So this margin of difference between the two candidates is narrowing quite quickly. And that is worrying for Emmanuel Macron, who warned supporters during a meeting on Saturday that they shouldn't just take the results for what it is. It isn't a sure victory for the incumbent president. They will have to fight, they will have to campaign, they will have to make the case about why he needs to stay in office. And Robin, the issue that is top of mind for voters in France, and something that Marine Le Pen is really campaigning on, trying to pick up support, is this question of inflation, shrinking purchasing power, rising energy prices, and the fact that outside of the big cities in France, there are a lot of people who are seeing their pocketbooks become more and more strained. She is trying to play to that card, say that she is the candidate who will do the most for them.
OK, Ryan Thompson in Paris, thanks very much.
5 people have been killed and more than 10 injured when a truck was hit by a train in southern Hungary near the Serbian border. The 5 victims were all in the truck, which was crossing the tracks. One of the train's carriages, which was derailed in the collision, causing the injuries. The rail operator says the truck ignored a red light. Sri Lankans continue to protest, demanding President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's removal, despite a state of emergency being declared. A deepening economic crisis is causing shortages of fuel and medicine, as well as prolonged power cuts. More than 40 lawmakers have left the coalition government, which follows the mass walkout of the cabinet. President Rajapaksa has called on opposition parties to help him form a government. Peru's capital, Lima, is under curfew after protests on Monday against rising fuel and fertilizer prices triggered by the conflict in Ukraine. President Pedro Castillo has now ordered residents there not to leave their homes. The government says 4 people have died in recent violent demonstrations. A suspected Sudanese militia commander has pleaded not guilty at the International Criminal Court to 31 charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ali Mohammed Ali Abd al-Rahman is thought to have been the leader of the pro-government Janjaweed militia group in Sudan's Darfur region 2 decades ago. Around 300,000 people died at the height of the conflict in 2003 and 2004.
Still to come on CGTN. Buildings marked by war and places changed by conflict. After the fighting ends, we look at the imprint it leaves behind.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Gas. So it's all begun now. Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
Is the front line now after 9 days of fighting?
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from the front line. Within clear view of this front line position.
Have you ever wondered how much a human life is worth?
Have you ever looked up at the night sky and considered whether aliens are staring back? Or if it's even possible to measure intelligence?
If that sounds like you, it's time to join the Answers Project with me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge.
We've recruited the best brains in the world, award-winning astrophysicists, giants of medical science, and former presidential advisors to help us tackle humanity's biggest questions.
Find the answers wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Across China, people are remembering deceased family members during the annual Tomb Sweeping Festival, or Qingming.
But with COVID cases rising across the country, some cemeteries have come up with new ways of honouring the dead. Joey Shin reports.
Since the pandemic began, there have been many obstacles and challenges for some people to go to the cemetery to sweep tombs during Qingming Festival to honour the dead. Cemeteries have come up with virtual services to help them observe the festival.
My father is 90 years old. He's eager to visit my mother's tomb to pay his respects, but it's too dangerous for the elderly to go to crowded places during the pandemic. We felt relieved when we heard about the cemetery's service of sweeping stones on behalf of our family members. The staff also sent us a video showing the sweeping process. Being able to see that means a great deal to us.
People can arrange for a staff member at the cemetery to visit their family member's tomb. As part of the service, workers read letters on behalf of the family members, clean the tombstones, and offer flowers to the deceased. In line with COVID countermeasures, the cemetery requires people to make appointments before visiting to avoid crowds. Wan'an, a funeral service in Beijing, allows 8,000 people to visit each day.
We offer fresh flowers for each visitor for free. Gradually, over the years, people aren't burning joss paper and joss sticks. As for our service of sweeping tombstones on behalf of family members, about a dozen households used the service during the whole Qingming period before the pandemic, most of whom were overseas and could not come to the cemetery. This year, at least 10 households used the service every day.
Over the past years, cemeteries also come up with new ways to bury the dead in a more environmentally friendly way and safe land. More and more people have chosen to bury their loved ones under designated trees, lawns, and in the ocean. There won't be a tombstone if loved ones are buried this way, but family members can always send their remembrance at a tree and by the sea. Zhou Yixing, CGTN, Beijing.
The imprint left by war can remain for decades, long after the fighting ends. Signs of conflict remain visible in buildings and landscapes, particularly around former front lines. CGTN's Johannes Pleshberger reports from Austria's southern border.
A disused railway station, a secret bunker, or a shut-up church. Photographer Helmut Weichselbraun and journalist Georg Lux rediscovered these and other forgotten places on Austria's southern border.
It's our passion to show the people the photos and to tell the stories. Every abandoned place has a story that is worth not being forgotten.
What happened to this chapel?
There was obviously a shooting. You see the holes in the wall, but it's not clear if there were soldiers from Yugoslavia or soldiers from Austria. Someone used this chapel as a hiding place.
It is the only geographic meeting point of Europe's three dominant language groups: Germanic, Romance and Slavic. Under Habsburg rule, they lived quite peacefully together, but after the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, new borders were fought over, cutting both this alpine landscape and important travel routes. The Austrian railway station in Tarvisio, for example, was first taken over by Italy and later left to decay.
There are so much possibilities to take really interesting photos. We have special details. We have the broken glass. We have the old books. The old books also tell their own story. And we have interesting lines and columns and so on. That makes my photos perfect.
The now abandoned military fortification Fort Hensel also changed hands between Austria and Italy.
After the Second World War, the Italian army built here bunkers in the mountain, hundreds of kilometers of tunnels. They were top secret and closed, and now they are open to curious people like us. This is a construction for fresh air for the soldiers in case of a gas attack. One soldier had to pump fresh air for the others by hand.
The bunkers even served as a hiding place for a nuclear bomb, which fortunately was never used. But after all three countries joined the European Union, the borders started to disappear again. According to local politicians, this formerly contested region is now a model for cooperation, and Austria, Italy and Slovenia are considering a joint bid for the 2034 Winter Olympics, here in the heart of Europe. Johannes Pleshberger, CGTN, tri-border area of Austria, Italy and Slovenia.
Now, magicians rely heavily on human logic and our capacity to predict outcomes in order to make their tricks work. But we're not the only species that can be fooled. Visual deception requires a level of intelligence that some birds, such as crows and magpies, are known to possess.
The University of Cambridge is using tricks designed by in-house magicians and psychologists to test the birds' cognitive skills. CGTN's Neil Cairns has the story.
It used to be an insult to call somebody a bird brain, meaning they didn't have much intelligence. But work here at the Cambridge Animal Behaviour Lab is showing that birds like these, that belong to the crow family, or corvids, are very intelligent indeed. And it's also shining a light on how intelligence itself evolved.
What we want to know
is whether non-human animals, be that jays, be that chimpanzees, be that whatever, have the same expectations as humans.
Why do you use magic?
Well, magic capitalizes on your expectations, right? If I grab this coin, you have an expectation of what I just done, because that's what normally happens when somebody grabs a coin.
I expect it's in that hand.
You expect that, yes, but that's the beauty of magic, right? It works on surprising your expectations, right?
That's good. That was good. That's very cool.
The interesting thing here is, why do humans develop these expectations, and do non-human animals also have them? Do non-human animals think about the world in the same way that we think about the world?
Right.
Okay, so you see the coin.
Yes.
I grab the coin.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I expect that you've grabbed it and
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
in that hand.
But like, you stopped seeing the coin very early on in the effect, right?
Yeah.
Everything that happened in between, you thinking where the coin is, you envisioning, you imagining where the coin is, you did that. I didn't do anything. The first thing that comes to mind is called object permanence. So even if you cannot see, hear, taste, or smell it, the object still exists. So corvids do something very interesting. They hoard. They just grab as much food as they can and they save it for later consumption. They hide little bits of food in the soil, and that's called a cache. Right. And the interesting thing is that object permanence, so this ability to actually understand that things, even if hidden, even if not observable, still exist, develops at the same time that they learn to hide things.
It's also about this idea that they understand there's a future, because they're putting that food away for a time, for the future, when
Absolutely.
they don't have food.
I mean, the theory of memory is that memory evolved with the future in mind, right? We remember things because we might need them in the future. So this is the palm effect.
Yeah.
I fake a palm, but they don't care that I faked it.
She gets it.
She gets it.
Which
and
is
now I
embarrassing.
do it slowly, and then
that's so
she gets
beautiful.
it. And then I do a real transfer, and she doesn't get it.
The birds get this trick right about as much as they get it wrong, which tells Eli that the movement does not offer them enough observable cues to make a clear choice. However, a human is fooled by this trick because they expect the worm to move from one hand to the other.
So this is the French drop.
So you're not fooling the bird very much?
Not with these two effects, no, because
Right.
they work because you have an expectation on hand movements.
Right.
Why should a bird have an expectation of hand movements?
Oh, because a bird's got wings.
Exactly.
Oh, that's a relief. I thought I was dumber than a bird. And these studies also remind us that what we call differences in intelligence are really often just about the different ways we perceive our world. A lesson as relevant for our understanding of ourselves as it is for our understanding of other species.
Neil Kenser from our science programme Razor.
The headlines again. Ukraine's president calls for Russian troops and their leaders to face a war crimes tribunal and warns the world has yet to see the full extent of their atrocities.
Scene of a massacre, the town of Bucha, where Russians allegedly gunned down civilians, including children.
And a crackdown on coal imports worth billions. The EU proposes a new package of sanctions on Russian goods.
That's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
There's more on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK 24 hours a day on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. All of the team here in London, goodbye.
Goodbye.